You didn't fool anyone. You know that feeling. You're sitting in a meeting, or you just got handed a bigger title, or you closed a deal nobody thought you'd close, and somewhere under all of it is this quiet, constant hum. Any minute now, someone's going to figure out you don't actually belong here. You felt it after a promotion. You felt it in a new role you're clearly qualified for on paper. You felt it when someone complimented your work and your first internal reaction wasn't, "Thank you." It was, "If they only knew." Here's the thing nobody tells you about that feeling, and it's going to sound backwards at first. It is not evidence that you're a fraud. It's one of the most reliable signs that you are operating right at the edge of your actual ability. The more real your competence gets, the more likely you are to feel like you don't have any, because competence and confidence are not the same system. They don't update on the same schedule. They don't run on the same clock, and most of what people call impostor syndrome is just the gap between those two clocks showing up as a feeling. In the next half hour, we'll open that gap and lay out 5 mechanisms that turn real competence into the feeling of fraud. Where the term came from, why the goalposts keep moving, why wins and losses get filed backwards, and what to actually do about it. What the term actually means. Let's start with where this thing even came from, because the origin story tells you a lot about what it is and isn't. In 1978, 2 psychologists, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes, published a study on a group of high-achieving women. These weren't people struggling to keep up. These were women with advanced degrees, professional awards, strong track records, real objective markers of success stacked up behind them. And yet, privately, a huge number of them believed they had somehow deceived everyone around them into overestimating their abilities. They didn't feel accomplished. They felt like they'd gotten away with something. Clance and Imes called this the impostor phenomenon, and the label stuck, though it later got sanded down into the more familiar impostor syndrome. That word syndrome is a little misleading, and it's worth clearing up right away. This is not a clinical diagnosis. It's not a disorder you either have or don't have, like a checklist in a medical manual. It's a pattern of thought, a recurring mental habit that shows up under specific conditions, in specific kinds of people, at specific moments, which is actually good news, because patterns of thought can be understood, traced back to their source, and interrupted. A disorder feels like something wrong with you at the core. A pattern is just a mechanism, and mechanisms have moving parts you can actually look at. So that's what we're doing for the rest of this episode. Not treating this as a flaw in your personality, but taking the mechanism apart, piece by piece, and showing you exactly which gears are turning when that feeling shows up. The hidden competence curve. The first mechanism is what we can call the hidden competence curve, and it starts with a simple, almost boring fact about how skill actually gets built. Most of the work that makes you good at something never gets seen by anyone. The failed first drafts. The version of the project you scrapped and started over. The hour you spent quietly confused, rereading the same paragraph of documentation, or the question you wanted to ask in the meeting but didn't, because you didn't want to look like you didn't already know the answer. All of that happens in private. What gets seen by your coworkers and, crucially, by your own memory is the polished output at the end, the clean pitch deck, the finished report, the answer you gave that sounded confident. Here's the problem. Your brain's internal tally of how competent am I is built almost entirely out of what got seen, including by you. So the invisible repetitions, the ones that actually did the work of building the skill, get quietly discounted, because your memory never properly logged them as effort in the first place. Think about a writer who has produced 200 rough, embarrassing drafts before finally landing one that's genuinely good. From the outside, and often from their own retrospective memory, that good piece of writing seems to arrive out of nowhere. It feels less like the product of 200 reps, and more like a fluke they got lucky enough to pull off once. That's not modesty. That's a measurement problem. The tally is missing almost all of its inputs, so the output looks unexplained, and unexplained success feels exactly like something you can't take credit for. This shows up in almost identical form outside of writing. A software engineer who finally ships a clean, elegant fix might have spent 3 days silently, stepping through a debugger, deleting dead ends, and rereading old code that didn't work. None of that shows up in the pull request. What shows up is 10 lines of code that look almost too simple to have taken 3 days. A surgeon who performs a difficult procedure smoothly has usually rehearsed the failure modes in their head dozens of times before ever touching a scalpel, has watched other surgeons handle the same complication, has sat with the anxiety of what could go wrong long before the operating room. None of that rehearsal is visible in the 40 minutes of confident, steady work everyone else actually sees. In every one of these cases, the visible moment is the tip of an iceberg, and the tally your brain keeps only counts what's above the waterline. That's the actual mechanics of the hidden competence curve. Not that you're lying to yourself, but that your own accounting system was never built to see most of the work in the first place. The moving reference group. Here's a second mechanism, and this one explains the feeling doesn't go away even after you've clearly improved, even after you've been promoted, even after you objectively know more than you did a year ago. Every time you level up, whether that's a promotion, a move to a new team, a jump into a new industry, you get placed next to a new group of people. And that new group is, almost by definition, further along than the group you just left. You didn't get worse. Your reference point moved. But your brain doesn't credit the distance you already traveled to get into that room. It resets the comparison to 0 and starts measuring you against the new ceiling instead of the old floor. Think of someone who spends 5 years becoming the most capable person on their team, then gets promoted into a room full of other people who were each the most capable person on their own team. Nothing about their skill changed the day of that promotion. What changed is the denominator. They used to be compared against a team where they stood out clearly. Now, they're compared against a room where everyone used to stand out just as clearly somewhere else. And standing out again from that baseline takes real time, even though their actual ability walked into the room exactly as strong as it was the day before. This is exactly why senior people with 15 or 20 years of experience, can still feel like beginners. Not because they've stopped growing, but because the goalposts for competent enough keep moving with every step forward they take. Yeah, you solve the problem that used to feel impossible, and instead of that becoming a permanent reference point for your own ability, it just becomes the new baseline, and a harder problem takes its place as the thing you're not sure you can do. It's a treadmill dressed up as a ladder. You're actually climbing. The view really is different than it used to be. But the felt experience is of never quite arriving, because arrival keeps getting redefined the moment you get there, which raises an obvious question. If growth doesn't get credited on its own, what does happen to the credit when things go right? And what happens to it when they go wrong? That's a different mechanism entirely, and it might be the sharpest one of the 5. The attribution flip. Psychologists have a well-documented pattern called the self-serving attribution bias. In its normal, healthy form, it works like this. When something goes well, people tend to credit themselves. When something goes badly, people tend to credit outside circumstances. It's a bit self-flattering, sure, but it's also a reasonably functional way to protect your motivation and keep moving forward after a setback. Impostor syndrome runs this exact same bias, but backwards. Success gets explained away. They just got lucky with that client. The timing worked out. Someone else on the team really carried that project. Meanwhile, failure or even just a gap in knowledge gets explained as something deep and true about who you actually are. Not I made a mistake on this specific task, but this is proof of who I really am underneath the performance. Watch it happen in a single week. Monday, a project lands well, and the explanation that surfaces first is the client was easy to work with, or the deadline gave us enough runway for once. Friday, a different project hits a snag, and the explanation that surfaces first is I should have caught that. This is exactly the kind of thing I always miss. Same person, same general skill level, two different events, and two completely different rules applied for deciding what each one says about them. Nobody consciously chooses to grade themselves this unevenly. The bias just quietly picks the explanation each time, and it always tilts the same direction. Notice what that does. It builds an evidence trail that only ever points one direction. Every win gets filed under external causes and quietly discarded as data about your actual ability. Every stumble gets filed under internal causes and kept as permanent, defining evidence. Over months and years, that produces a completely lopsided internal record, one where the failures pile up as the truth and the successes evaporate as noise, even though, from the outside, anyone looking at the actual results would see the opposite pattern. This flipped attributions is arguably the single most corrosive piece of the whole mechanism, because it's not just misreading the present moment. It's actively rewriting your own history in real time, one win and one loss at a time. And it connects directly to a strange pattern researchers have found when they compare how confident people feel to how much they actually know. The expertise paradox. To understand this next piece, it helps to look at its mirror image first. In 1999, researchers David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a now famous study on what happens when people have very little skill in an area. Their finding, often called the Dunning-Kruger effect, is that novices with low ability in a given skill tend to overestimate that ability, because the same lack of knowledge that makes them bad at the task also makes them bad at recognizing how bad they are at it. They don't know enough to know what they don't know. Now, flip that around and follow it in the other direction, because that's where imposter syndrome actually lives. As you genuinely grow more skilled in something, you don't just get better at the task. You also get a clearer and clearer view of how large the whole field actually is, how many subtleties exist that you hadn't even noticed before, how many experts ahead of you are operating at a level you didn't know existed 6 months ago. Growing expertise expands your view of the mountain at the same time it's helping you climb it. And that expanded view can absolutely feel like doubt, even while your actual ability is climbing in a straight line. This is the expertise paradox. The novice, who knows the least, often feels the most confident, because their view of the field is small enough that mastering it feels within reach. The expert, who knows dramatically more, can feel less confident, because their view of the field has grown even faster than their skill has. That feeling isn't a malfunction. It's what an accurate, expanding map of a difficult subject actually feels like from the inside. You can see this pattern clearly in something as ordinary as learning a language. Someone 3 months into learning Spanish can hold a basic conversation and feel genuinely capable because their whole mental map of the language is the few hundred words and handful of tenses they've encountered so far. Someone 5 years in, fluent by almost any practical measure, often feels far less sure of themselves, because now they've run into regional slang they don't recognize, subjunctive constructions that still trip them up, and native speakers who talk at a speed that exposes gaps they didn't know existed. The 5-year learner is unambiguously better. But the 5-year learner's map of the language is enormous compared to the 3-month learners, and a bigger map always has more unexplored territory visible on it. That's not the 5-year learner failing. That's what looking honestly at a large, real subject feels like from the inside. But here's what makes it worse. And this next mechanism might be the most universal one of all. Everyone is hiding the same thing. And doubt is private. Confidence is performed. That's the whole problem in one sentence. Nobody walks into a meeting and opens with their 2 a.m. spiral about whether they're actually good at their job. Nobody puts quietly unsure if I deserve this in their bio. What you see from everyone around you, your coworkers, your boss, the confident-sounding person on the panel at the conference, is the curated, external version, the version that's already been edited for public consumption. What you have access to for exactly one person is the raw, unfiltered internal experience, complete with every doubt, every half-formed thought, every moment of wait, am I actually bad at this? That person is you. So you end up running a deeply unfair comparison, over and over, without ever noticing you're doing it. You're comparing your rawest internal footage to everyone else's highlight reel, and concluding from that mismatch that you must be the only one struggling. Here's the twist that makes this mechanism almost darkly funny once you see it. Because everyone is doing this exact same comparison, in the exact same direction. You end up with a room full of people who are each privately unsure of themselves, each one convinced they're the lone exception, each one performing exactly the calm, capable exterior that's fooling everyone else in the room. It's not that nobody in that room has doubts. It's that the doubt is evenly distributed and the confidence is unevenly displayed. Once you actually understand that the room is built this way, the whole illusion gets a lot harder to fall for. Who feels it hardest and why? These 5 mechanisms don't land on everyone equally, and it's worth being specific about who tends to get hit hardest. Because it's not about being less capable. It's about having less of a certain kind of feedback signal available to lean on. Take first-generation professionals, people who are the first in their family to work in this kind of role. They don't have a parent or an older sibling who can tell them, from lived experience, yes, this confusion you're feeling in your first year is completely normal. I felt it too. They're building the template from scratch, in real time, with no internal reference for what competent is even supposed to feel like at this level. Take career switchers, people who moved into a new field entirely. Their peers in the new field often have 5 or 10 years of small, informal validation already banked. The little nods, the nice catch comments, the accumulated confidence that comes from just being around long enough to absorb the unwritten rules. The switcher is starting that clock from 0 while sitting next to people whose clock has been running for a decade. And take remote workers who've lost something that used to do a lot of quiet, invisible work. The hallway conversation, the small, hey, that was a good call on the way to grab coffee. The tiny social cues that used to confirm, almost constantly, that you belonged in the room. Strip those out and the only signal left is the big, formal, occasional kind. A review, a promotion, a headline metric, which is a much thinner and much less frequent stream of reassurance than a body needs. There's a 4th group worth naming too. People managing former peers. Get promoted to lead the team you used to be part of. And suddenly the people whose opinion used to reassure you are the people you're now supposed to be evaluating instead of leaning on. The informal feedback loop that used to run sideways, colleague to colleague, gets cut off the moment the relationship becomes vertical. You can't casually ask the person you now manage whether you're doing this right, at least not without it feeling strange to both of you. So that channel of reassurance goes quiet at exactly the moment you need it most. None of this is a flaw in these people. It's a gap in the feedback signal they have access to, and gaps in signal can be filled deliberately, which is exactly where we're headed. But first, it's worth being honest about what it actually costs to leave that gap unfilled. The real cost of leaving it unmanaged. This isn't just an uncomfortable feeling that sits quietly in the background while your career moves forward unaffected. Left alone, it shapes actual behavior, and the behavior it shapes almost always works against you. It looks like over-preparing for a meeting that never needed 3 hours of prep. because some part of you is trying to outwork a gap that isn't actually there. It looks like chronic overworking, staying late, taking on more than your role requires, as a way of trying to earn a seat that was never actually in question in the first place. It looks like staying quiet in a room where your input genuinely mattered, because raising your hand felt like a risk of exposure rather than a normal contribution. And it looks like hesitating, again and again, to apply for the role you're qualified for or to ask for. The raise the work has already justified, because some internal committee keeps voting that you haven't earned it yet, no matter what the actual evidence says. Picture two people with nearly identical skill, 3 years into the same kind of role. One of them has a quiet, persistent sense that they're behind, so they say yes to every extra project, decline vacation days they've earned, and rewrite the same email 4 times before sending it, just in case. The other doesn't carry that weight, so they take on a normal, sustainable workload, speak up in the meetings where they actually have something to add, and apply for the stretch role when it opens instead of waiting to feel 100% ready first. 5 years later, the second person has a longer list of visible wins, not because they were more talented at the start, but because they spent their energy on the work itself instead of on managing a feeling that was never really about the work. The gap between them isn't ability, it's where the hours went. None of this is really about negotiation, tactics, or interview technique. Those are downstream problems with downstream fixes. This is upstream of all of that. It's the mindset quietly deciding, before you've even gotten to the negotiation table, that you shouldn't be sitting there at all. And that's the real cost. Not the feeling itself, but the years of opportunities it quietly talks you out of pursuing. Multiply that across a decade of career decisions, and the cost stops looking like a mood and starts looking like a second, invisible ceiling stacked right underneath the real one. What actually helps? Evidence over feeling. So what actually works here? Not just be more confident, because telling someone with a distorted internal record to simply feel differently, without giving them new inputs, is like telling someone to trust a scale that's been broken for years. The fix has to change the inputs, not just the instruction. Here's a concrete practice worth building. Keep a running, specific log of evidence. Not vague affirmations, actual entries. The decision you made that turned out to be right. The problem you solved that nobody else on the team could crack. The thing you shipped that a client or a boss specifically praised. Write it down when it happens, in plain factual language, no editorializing. The reason this works goes back to the very first mechanism we covered. The feeling of being a fraud isn't built to track facts. It's built to track exposure risk, to scan for anything that might reveal you as inadequate. Those are two completely different jobs, and the feeling is doing its job, just not the job you actually need done right now. A written log gives you a second source of information, one that isn't subject to the same real-time distortion, something you can go back and actually read on the day the feeling shows up loud. Pair that with one simple reframing question whenever the doubt spikes. Would I judge a friend this harshly for the exact same gap? Almost nobody would. We extend basic, reasonable patience to the people we care about, and we withhold it entirely from ourselves. Asking that question out loud, even just in your own head, is often enough to expose how disproportionate the internal verdict actually is. There's a second technique worth pairing with the log, and it takes about 10 seconds. Before you walk into a moment that triggers this feeling, a big presentation, a hard conversation, a first day, ask yourself one specific question. What would I tell a colleague with my exact track record to do here? Not a stranger. Someone with your exact resume, your exact results, sitting in your exact seat. Most people ask that question, immediately give confident, direct advice, because they can see that colleague's evidence clearly, without the fog. The trick just points that same clarity back at yourself. When it's not imposter syndrome. Now, An important line has to be drawn here, because not every moment of professional doubt is this mechanism, and treating every single one as imposter syndrome can actually cause you to ignore a real, legitimate signal. Sometimes discomfort is accurate. Sometimes it's telling you that a genuine skill gap exists, one that needs real upskilling, not reassurance, and not a journaling habit. So here's the test. Ask whether the doubt is attached to something specific and checkable. I don't fully understand this technical process yet, and I could name exactly what I'd need to learn to close that gap. That's signal. That's useful information, and the right move is to go act on it. Take the course. Ask the specific question. Put in the specific reps. Take two people who both feel unsure about a new role. The first one says, specifically, that they don't yet know how the deployment pipeline works on this team. And if you ask them to name the exact 3 things they'd need to learn to close that gap, they could list them right now. That's a checkable claim. It has an edge, a beginning, and an end, and it resolves the moment the skill is actually learned. The second person can't point to anything that specific. Ask what exactly they don't know, and the answer stays vague. They just have a feeling that they're not as good as everyone thinks, a feeling that was there before this job and was there in the job before that one too, regardless of what actually happened in either role. The first case has a fix with a deadline. The second one doesn't, because there's no specific gap to close. It's not a checklist problem. It's the pattern we've spent this whole episode taking apart. Misread it in either direction, and it costs you. Treat a real skill gap as imposter syndrome, and you skip the actual studying, the actual practice, the thing that would have closed the gap for good, and the doubt just sits there because nothing changed. Treat the imposter pattern as a real skill gap, and you end up chasing certificate after certificate, credential after credential, trying to outstudy a feeling that was never about your knowledge in the first place, and the shelf of certificates does nothing to quiet it. But if the doubt is vague and global, a general sense of fraudulence that persists no matter how much consistent outside evidence piles up against it, promotions, praise, results, and none of it makes a dent, that's the imposter pattern. The tell isn't the presence of doubt. Doubt is normal and often useful. The tell is whether the doubt can be pinned to something concrete you could actually fix, or whether it just floats above every achievement, immune to updating, no matter what you accomplish. One is a map telling you where to walk next. The other is a broken compass that spins no matter which direction you're actually facing. The full picture. Let's put the whole mechanism back together, because that's really the point of taking it apart in the first place. It starts with a hidden competence curve, where all the invisible work that built your skill never gets counted, so your own progress looks unexplained even to you. Layer on a moving reference group, where every step forward resets the finish line instead of moving it closer, so improvement never quite feels like arrival. Add an attribution flip, where wins get filed as luck and losses get filed as identity, quietly rewriting your own track record in the wrong direction. Mix in the expertise paradox, where growing skill also grows your awareness of everything you still don't know, so competence and doubt can rise together instead of one replacing the other. And finish with the fact that everyone around you is hiding the exact same private experience behind a performed, confident exterior, so you keep comparing your rawest footage to everyone else's highlight reel. 5 separate mechanisms, and not one of them requires you to actually be unqualified. That's the reframe worth carrying out of this episode. That feeling was never a verdict on your ability. It was a predictable side effect of getting good at something faster than your internal feedback loop could keep up with. Understanding the machinery behind it doesn't erase the feeling overnight, but it does strip away its authority, and that matters more than any pep talk ever could, because a pep talk asks you to override the feeling. Understanding the mechanism lets you see straight through it instead. If this helped you make sense of something you've been carrying quietly for a while, stick around, subscribe, and we'll keep taking these mechanisms apart, one episode at a time.